Hello my friends, and welcome along to the story cabin after what has been a bit of a break. Now our story today is called The Wyrm of Bosforph, and it is of course as always for all of you, but in particular for a good friend of mine called Paul, whose birthday was a few days ago. Happy birthday mate, this is for you and for everybody else of course. But before we get started, I need a story waistcoat, and I do need to give a little bit of a warning as well, because the description of the Wyrm of Bosforph might be a little frightening. We'll put our teeth in, shall we, for the littlest listeners and viewers. Okay, I'm going to get that waistcoat. Bear with me a second. There we go. That's better. The Wyrm of Bosforph. There was once a town called Bosforph, although you won't find it on any map or in any land today. And in that town there lived a young lad called Jack. Now Jack was of an age when he was supposed to be apprenticed to one master or another to learn a task, a skill. But he was interested in everything. And so he spent his days going round and helping as many people as he could and learning as he went. And the people he helped most often were a woodsman who cut trees far up on the slopes overlooking the town, an old retired sailor who caught fish in the river, and a stonemason who cut blocks of stone for buildings in the town from an old quarry that had a deep, deep lake at the bottom of it. Now on the day of our story, Jack was up on the high slopes with the woodsman, just preparing to sned or cut the branches off of the trunk of a tree, when he heard the most terrible sound. It sounded like the hinges of 100 rusty gates being pulled backwards and forwards. It sounded like 1,000 steel scales being clashed together. It sounded like 10,000 sets of teeth chewing down on an old tin plate. Jack put his hands over his ears and went, "Ah!" And as he looked down towards the town and the old quarry nearby with the deep lake at the bottom of it, he saw coming up from that lake the most terrible worm he had ever seen. Now a worm is just another name for a dragon, and this one had steel scales all over its body, was meters and meters and meters long and coiled, terrible fangs that dripped what might have been poison or just saliva, 2 baleful eyes, and it made this terrible noise as it came, destroying buildings in the town with the flapping of its tail or the biting of its jaws. And everybody ran from the town as fast as they could. Jack watched as the last people escaped from the town and the worm settled down to chew and eat parts of the buildings. And then, as the sun began to set, making the same terrible noise, it slid back across the town to the lake, slipped in and disappeared. Now it certainly didn't live in this lake. People had swum in this lake before. But it was obviously a doorway to who knows what terrible and watery realm, and the worm had come through. Jack went down and met on the outskirts of the town the remaining townsfolk, for some had been killed by the terrible, terrible creature. And to each of them he said, "Right, what can we do?" And every person said to him, Nothing, there is nothing to do. We're just going to have to leave. But Jack wouldn't have it. And after talking to many, many people, he decided that he would go and visit a famous wise woman, the Magus of 1,000 Steps, who lived in a cave in a cliff by the sea, and that he would set off the very next morning. That evening, Jack sat around a fire with the old fisherman and the woodsman and the stonemason, and they talked. They talked about his journey. And the old woodsman said to Jack, "Boy, I ain't got much I can give thee, but what I will give you is the story of the King of the Trees. Now, this is a true woodsman's story, and you may use it, but you must return it to me once you's done." Jack thanked him. And the retired sailor said, "I haven't got much I can give you, but what I can do is I can give you the story of the baker and the sea king's daughter. Now, this is a true sailor and fisherman's tale, and you may use it, but you must return it to me once you are done." Jack said thank you, and he listened and learnt the story. The stonemason said, "Well, I haven't got much I can give you, but I also have a story. It's the story of the man who wished he was a mountain. It's a proper stonemason story, and you may use it, but you must return it to me once you are done." And Jack said thank you and listened and learnt the story. And then the next morning he headed off. It was a 3-day journey to the coast, and when he got there, he found himself on top of a cliff. A cliff with stairs cut into the face going down, steps. 1,001 of them, for this was a very high cliff indeed. Jack walked down the stairs one at a time, being buffeted about by the wind, clinging to the cliff face from time to time when it got too windy. And when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he found himself facing the black entrance to a cave, as black as a blink on a moonless night. Jack didn't hesitate for a moment. He stepped inside, and the moment he stepped inside, he found himself in the most amazing room. There were tapestries and hangings on every wall, and doors heading off in all different directions. He turned to look behind him, and the door he had come through was filled with fog, and spray from the sea splashed against his face. He turned and looked again, and there in the middle of the room was a huge table, and on it were hundreds, no, thousands of interesting objects, the likes of which Jack had never seen. And seated at the table, looking at these objects in turn and making notes in a huge book, was the Magus of 1,000 Steps. A young woman dressed in yellow and blue, who looked up from her work and said, "Hello, Jack. How can I help?" Jack didn't waste any time. He didn't even ask how she knew his name. He told her about the attack, about the Wyrm, and the terrible devastation in the town. "Ah," said the Magus, "well, there is no weapon, none, in this land or any other, that can defeat such a Wyrm as this." "Oh," said Jack, "so that's it, the town is lost?" "Not necessarily," said the Magus. "What was the first thing you noticed about the Wyrm?" "Oh," said Jack, "the terrible scales." No, said the Magus. "What was the first thing you noticed about the Wyrm?" "Ah, these fangs." No, said the Magus. "What was the very first thing you noticed about the worm? The noise, said Jack. It made this terrible sound. Yes, said the Magus, and that is its weakness, sound. Here, and she began to rummage across the table, looking for something, turning other items over, and she pulled out the thing that she wanted. It had a flat top on it, was made of wood, and a curved back, and there was a hole in the centre of the flat top. She gave it to Jack and said, "There, take it." Jack took it and he looked at it, and he looked inside the hole and he said, how does this help? Sound, said the Magus, is the worm's weakness. You must make an instrument that will drive it away. That is the body of the instrument that I have given you. But the other 3 elements you must find for yourself. The neck must be made from a limb of the tree taken from the ironwood forest. The 3 strings of the instrument must be made, each one from the hair of one of the 3 mermaids that guards the great bay where the river Pent goes to the sea. For when they sing together, no creature can attack them or resist. And the instrument must be strummed with a shard from a diamond. How am I going to get the shard of a diamond? Ah, I'm glad you asked, said the Magus. You know the mountain range about 3 days' travel to the north of your town? Yes, said Jack. Well, said the Magus, part of that mountain range is not mountains at all, but a great stone giant that sleeps lying on its side, so big that it looks like mountains. And once a year, on Midsummer's Eve, it shifts, the giant moves, and if you are brave and quick, you can get underneath the giant, take out a diamond. For there's so much pressure underneath it that coal is turned into diamonds right down in its heart. And then all you need to do is get the giant to open its mouth and bite down on the gem, and it will shatter and you will be able to take a shard of diamond. But very well, said Jack, I will find a way. And so he headed off, first to the ironwood forests. Now the ironwood trees, famed for their strength, and are guarded by 10 figures, each one as large as any person you have ever seen. And each of those guardians carries a great axe, and none of them will let anyone take even a twig from the ironwood trees. Jack walked for the 3 days it took to reach the ironwood forest. And there, on its eastern border, he found the 10 guardians. And he told them of his plight. And they stood in a circle around him, their hands resting on their axes, and they did not say a word. And he begged them for their help. And they stood around him in a circle, and they listened, and they did not say a word. And in the end he cried in frustration. And they stood around him in a circle and listened and did not say a word. And he was going to leave when suddenly a thought crossed his mind. He turned back to the 10 guardians and he said, I have a story to share. And he sat down in the middle of that circle and he told them the story of the King of the Trees. And when he had finished, the largest of the guardians nodded her head, picked up her axe, turned and walked into the forest. There were the sound of blows as though of axe on tree, and when she returned, she brought a dressed branch from one of the trees with a flat face on it, perfect to be the neck of the instrument Jack had to make. He bowed low and thanked them and went on his way. Next, he found his way to the great bay where the River Pent ran into the sea. And he asked people who lived thereabout where he could find the mermaids, and they told him that they would swim up onto the rocks on the southern shore of the bay and watch the sunset, and they would sing. So Jack went down to the bay and he waited by the southern rocks until the mermaids came out of the water. And he told them of his plight, and he begged them for a hair from each of their heads to form the strings. And he described the terrible Wyrm in all the detail that he could. And the mermaid said, "But we cannot give you this unless you come and play with us and sing with us and come down beneath the sea with us and learn of the lands beneath the sea. And then maybe we will give you a hair from our heads." Now Jack knew he did not have that sort of time. He didn't want to go with the mermaids, but he didn't know what else he could do. And he was about to walk away when he suddenly thought, "Wait." And he turned to them and he said, "But I do know of your land. For I know the story of the baker and the sea king's daughter." And he sat beside them on the rock and he told them the story, which is probably a story for another day as far as we're concerned. And each of them, once he had finished, smiled and nodded and plucked one hair from their heads and handed them over. And Jack took them and strung them onto the instrument. So now he had the body of the instrument from the magus and the neck and headstock of the instrument from the ironwood forest and the strings of the instrument from the mermaids in the great bay of the River Pent. But he didn't have the diamond shard with which he would have to play. He travelled north and came to the great mountain range, and it was just as the magus had said. For when you looked closely at the mountains, most of them were great peaks, but one place, an edge of a mountain where it fell away, looked almost like somebody's shoulder, and an outcropping looked like a nose and a mouth. A whole length of this mountain range, miles long, was a great stone giant asleep on its side. Jack had a few days to wait until Midsummer's Day. And on Midsummer's Day, just as the magus predicted, that giant stretched and moved and rumbled, and its waist lifted up from the ground just a touch, just enough to leave room for Jack to crawl in on his belly underneath, and he scrambled his way through. And as he went deeper underneath the giant, the light began to fade, and he scrabbled until he felt something cold under his hand, something cold and solid with many faces, like a diamond. And then he turned and he could just see a little line of light in the distance. He had crawled so far under the giant, and he began to crawl back. And rumbling sounds started coming from above him, so he crawled faster. And groaning sounds started coming from above him, so he crawled faster. And just in time, Jack struggled his way out from under the giant, and the giant settled itself down onto the ground. Jack held in his hand a huge diamond, but he needed a diamond shard, and he thought to himself, how am I going to get the giant to bite down on this? He scrambled and climbed his way up onto the face of the giant, and he tried everything he could think of. He shouted in its ear, and he crawled up one nostril and kicked inside its nose, and he climbed up onto the top of its head to pull its hair, but its hair was great oak trees. And eventually Jack was going to give up. He couldn't think of what else to do, when he remembered the story from the stonemason. And he went and sat by the ear of the giant, and he began to tell the story. The story of the man who wished he was a mountain. And as he told the story, the giant began to move a little, and then Jack realised began to laugh. Still calling out the story as he climbed down, Jack went down onto the lips of the stone giant, and as the giant laughed again, he took the diamond and he lodged it right inside one tooth of the giant. Jack dropped down, sliding down the face of the mountain, down to the ground, and finished the tale at an absolute shout. The giant laughed once more, and then closed its jaws, and shards of diamond shattered out from one of its teeth. Jack went running, and he picked up one of the shards. He gathered them all together and looked and found one, just the right shape, it seemed to him, to play the instrument. And so armed, he returned to the town of Bosforph. He waited for a day, he waited for a week, he waited for a month, he waited for a year. And a year to the day after it had first appeared with that terrible sound, Jack was awoken early in the morning by the noise, a noise like the hinges of 100 rusty iron gates being open and shut, a noise like 1,000 steel scows being crashed together, a noise like 10,000 teeth grinding down onto an old tin plate. And metre upon metre, coil upon coil, covered in steel scales with great fangs and 2 baleful eyes, the Wyrm appeared out of the lake, coming from who knows what watery and dreadful realm. And the Wyrm, spying him, rushed forwards, darted, struck at him like a snake. But as it got close, Jack took the diamond shard and he hit the 3 strings, the 3 hairs of the mermaid, and together they put forth a sound of 1,000 voices, raised in an amazing harmony. All the noises and joys of life came flooding from this instrument that Jack held. The wave of sound hit the Wyrm like a giant hand, slapping it aside. Its scales began to shed, its teeth began to twist, and its eyes bled tears of black, thick blood. And metre by metre, coil by coil, that Wyrm retreated back into the lake and disappeared, taking its dreadful sound with it. Jack stood on the edge of the lake and played one last chord on the instrument he had made, which sent sound down through the waters of the lake and sealed whatever gate there was between the lake of Bosforph and the terrible watery realm of the Wyrm. Now people had abandoned Bosforth, and so Jack headed off to nearby towns, looking for the people that used to live there, to tell them the good news. But of course everyone had started their lives anew. Very few people wanted to move back. And in time, Jack found the old sailor, and he gave him the 3 hairs from the mermaids' heads and said, "Thank you for the story. It was most useful. Here, I return it to you now." And he found the woodsman, and he took the neck from the instrument made from the ironwood tree, and he handed it to the woodsman, and he said, "Thank you for the story. Here, I return it to you now. It was most useful." And he took the diamond shard, and he gave it to the stonemason, and he said, "Thank you for the story. It was most useful. Here, I return it to you now." And then only one job remained. He took the body of the instrument back to the cave of Magus of 1,001 steps, and with great thanks gave it back to her, and turned to leave. And Magus said, "Where are you going to go?" And Jack said, "I do not know." "Well, there is plenty to learn here," said the Magus, "for each of these doors leads somewhere else. Who knows what you might discover?" And so Jack passed his days, learning as many things as the mind can imagine. The town of Bosforth disappeared from the land and from maps and from memory. And that worm, well, I cannot tell you if it was killed by the wonderful instrument that Jack had made. So perhaps, just perhaps, if you are near deep and dangerous or fast-flowing water, you should be just a little careful. For who knows what terrible and watery realm they may connect to. And that, my friends, is the story of the Wyrm of Bosforth. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you back here again in the story cabin for another story, another day. Until then, take care.